Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world for the sixth edition of the Kalpana Chawla Annual Space Policy Dialogue. My name is Pulkit Mohan, and I'm an Associate Fellow with ORF's Center for Security, Strategy and Technology. Today, we are joined with Professor S. Chandrasekhar. He is the JRD Tata Chair Visiting Professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Prior to this, he spent more than 20 years working at the Indian Space Research Organization, where his work covered all parts of the space program, including satellites, rockets, as well as the applications of space technology, especially remote sensing. Today, we will be talking about Professor Satish Dhawan. As many of us may know, Professor Satish Dhawan's 100th birth anniversary was in 2020. His tenure as chairman of ISRO saw many major achievements. So my first question is, however, that there is a possibility that many people in India may not be aware of what he did. What do you think were his major achievements and contributions to the space program?
Uh, when Vikram Sarabhai passed away, the space program was at an almost infant or a nascent stage of its evolution. What Vikram Sarabhai had left behind was groups of engineers and scientists working in a limited way on a set of problems and on a set of projects. Uh, there was this vision that India was going to get transformed through the applications of space technology. And the notion was that an INSAT satellite would provide the necessary connectivity to all corners of the country. And a GSLV or a geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle would be the means of which India would be able to put such satellites into orbit. While these were and the other thing that was emerging at that time was remote sensing and all the applications associated with remote sensing. And Vikram Sarabhai saw many potential applications of this new evolving capability at that time. Now, when he passed away, all these were very far away on the distant horizon. And and how to get there and what exactly to do in order for India to be able to achieve these great milestones and landmarks was very, very unclear. Professor Dhawan was the architect, or I would argue the architect come visionary, who actually managed to transform the vision of Vikram Sarabhai into strong capabilities and competencies that have stood ISRO in good stead over its fairly long period of existence. So he was really what I would call a visionary architect who created what I would call the space ecosystem.
Right, sir. So you said he was the visionary architect of the space program. Could you possibly give us some more specific details about what he did?
See, when Sarabhai passed away, the ISRO had ongoing three projects. One was a satellite project called Aryabhatta, which was the first satellite that was going to be launched by the Soviet Union. The second was the SLV-3 project, which was largely an indigenous effort to build a small rocket, right, that could put a 40-kilogram satellite into orbit. And the third was a major application experiment called the Satellite Instruction Television Experiment, in which we used a satellite loaned by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration of the US, called the ATS-6, in order to beam educational programs to the villages of India. These were the three projects that were ongoing by Professor Dhawan inherited. As you can see, one is a satellite project, one is an application project, and one was a launcher project. All of them are totally unconnected and unrelated in any way, right? And that was really the kind of issue that is faced. So what Professor Dhawan inherited was a way forward by means of which the realization of an INSAT satellite, the realization of a GSLV launch vehicle, the ability to build and use remote sensing satellites were all had to be converted from what is called a visionary status into a practical reality status. So he actually, in a sense, provided what is called an ecosystem. So he saw this as a network. He had to build up what he saw as a network of capabilities and competencies that connected resources, various kinds of resources, including human resources, technological resources, with organizations, different user organizations, capabilities inside the space organization, different kinds of institutions, rule making, regulators, etc. And actually the applications that were important for the people of the country. So he created what at that time was a network of capabilities and competencies to realize these goals. Now, today we call these ecosystems, but Professor Dhawan created the first space ecosystem in the country without even using this term. We never used this term in the early days, but today everybody talks about it. So he was the creator, in a sense, of the space ecosystem.
Right. So I think we could say that Vikram Sarabhai was a lot more well connected to the higher level decision making within the country. And we could possibly see that Dhawan did not have that luxury. What do you think he did to get the support for the space effort?
See, when uh, when Professor Dhawan took over, there was no great positive response from the telecom ministry, for example, that there was the need for a INSAT kind of satellite. I've even seen a letter from the secretary of the telecom ministry addressed to the secretary or the chairman of ISRO, which said that they saw no future in such satellites. Okay, the TV people were kind of lukewarm about the whole thing, and whether they wanted it or not was not very clear. So one was not sure what kind of things they needed. So Professor Dhawan believed that, in order to build up a user involvement and to make sure that the capabilities and technology, the satellites and rockets are just platforms, right? By means of which you realize hardware. But to actually make all these things work, you need the involvement of various user ministries. And therefore, he set about creating a way in which the user ministries would get familiar with the potential capabilities of space technology, right? So he set in place a number of experiments. So we did an experiment with the European Symphony satellite called STEP, Satellite Telecommunication Experiment Project, which basically laid the foundations for a lot of the communications capabilities that we needed. We commissioned a number of we bought data reception rights from the US Landsat and the French Spot satellites, so that we could build up the application capability in the uses of remote sensing. So at one level we did all that. He also did a number of other things. He built up three value chains. Right, the first value chain is what I would call a remote sensing value chain. He came up with the notion of converting the Aryabhatta platform into a platform for remote sensing. We called it the Bhaskara project. And it was the first kind of project that integrated the satellite capability with the application capability and the user community. Then, he linked this with a set of user experiments, which then fed back into the need for the Indian remote sensing satellite, which he saw as the major application satellite. So he created that framework by means of which we could do, right? So that was one value chain. And we worked a lot with user ministries in order to define. So this was a project, the IRS was a project that was actually defined by a set of user ministries who had a set of requirements. And through a process of iteration and trial and error, we actually decided on what kinds of sensors. We did a similar thing for the communication thing, right? There was an opportunity to launch a satellite on one of the Ariane test flights. And ISRO seized that opportunity to build what is called the first geostationary communication satellite in the country, called Apple. Okay, so we did Apple as a precursor to INSAT. And while we were doing Apple, we were also going ahead and defining what INSAT should be, building up the application capability. And so we went and built up the INSAT capability also parallelly along with the Apple project. Okay, and so then Professor Dhawan, the other master stroke that Professor Dhawan did was SLV3 was the launch capability, right? And it was a very small capability, 40 kilogram can do nothing. So we needed a kind of roadmap for linking the rockets with the satellites. Right? So the PSLV was a Satish Dhawan original innovation concept. He linked up Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, which is also one of the most successful launches anywhere in the world, with the remote sensing capability as a kind of intermediate step to realizing the geostationary capability. And of course, he linked up the GSLV capability derived from the PSLV also to look at the INSAT. So in other words, the remote sensing value chain, the communication value chain, and the launcher value chain got integrated into a complete system. And Professor Dhawan was the architect of this system. That is the reason why I think And it is also the first example of what I would call a a complex system being driven by a user demand. I think nobody in the government of India had ever come up with such a system in order to define a kind of space. Right? And I think Professor Dhawan's unique contribution was that he involved the user ministries and through them defined the systems that he needed, which I think nobody had ever done before, and which he.
Thank you, sir. So, how would you say ISRO was organized during the Satish Dhawan era?
Well, in a sense, you could argue that, yeah, ISRO was like every other organization in terms of project organization. We had a number of domain areas, like, you could have a structures group, you could have a control group, and a propellant group, and an integration group, and all that. So at one level, we were what I call verticals, and cutting across the verticals, we had these project management structures. For example, IRS project management structure was it had a program management board, which was the key executive entity with with a project director. Now, the project director in ISRO had a fairly substantial amount of powers. Now, one of the unique things about ISRO was it had a book of financial powers that was kind of different from what was traditional government organizations. It was largely the legacy of Sarabhai to some extent, and Professor Dhawan built upon that legacy. So we could actually delegate a lot of the financial powers to the project directors and below them to the project engineers who work on specific projects. So most of the project engineers belong to the verticals, but they kind of integrated through the project management board and the system integration group to actually produce the product that would constitute the project. Okay, so that was the thing. At a higher level, you had a program director. So we could have, for example, two or three INSAT or IRS projects running together. And you would have a program director that kind of oversaw all of them to make sure that that part of it was covered. And they were all run, okay, with the center directors who were who were in charge of the verticals in some sense. So you built up a kind of cross network. In those days, we called it a matrix structure, okay, of management. All projects were supposed to be matrix structure. But in today's world, we know we are more familiar with what are called network organizations. So Professor Dhawan, in a sense, created one of the first networked organizations. And mind you, this was done within the framework of the government of India, which is fairly bureaucratic. Okay, so it was a kind of unique hybrid kind of structure that he created in order to do that. Now, the second thing that was very unique about the ISRO system was the interface with the outside world was done through two major councils. For example, to manage the INSAT system, we had what is called an INSAT Coordination Council that had the secretaries of all the major user ministries associated with INSAT. Okay, so he kind of did that also as a part of that. And in IRS, we had what's called a National Natural Resource Management System, which also had a bunch of secretaries of various kinds of user entities that formed. So these were the application-driven interfaces that made the entire ISRO system work. So in other words, it was like a loop continuing a chain, right? So the user ministries drove the specifications of the satellites and the applications, which in turn was delivered, and then that in turn drove the further set of requirements. So Professor Dhawan saw it as an evolving dynamic that continuously iterated between the application needs and the system and the technology capabilities of the satellites and rockets that were needed to make them work. So this was a kind of unique thing that he did. Okay, so this is this is what I call again a kind of very original concept that nobody had seen in India.
Right. So, sir, building upon that, you said that ISRO was good at both routine project activities as well as creative activities. Could you tell us a little bit about the organization structure and processes that Professor Dhawan used to make this happen?
Well, at one level, when Sarabhai passed away, right, he had left behind a very loose conglomeration of different kinds of activities, basically organized around individuals, not so much around groups, you would argue, mainly around individuals, each of whom had a few people working with them. So it was a very fragmented and what shall we say, very chaotic kind of structure that was in place at that time. And that kind of a structure is needed in the initial phase of the creation of any kind of creative organization. So, in a sense, I think he followed that example. What Professor Dhawan did was to take this fragmented group of people and actually give it a formal structure. So at one level, you can argue that he created a formal structure that was a part of being able to deliver, right, a complex product like a SLV3 launcher or an IRS satellite, which is needed. So in other words, we need a lot of routine in organizations in order to deliver products that have value that serve various kinds of application needs at the time. So that is a requirement, and he did that requirement, and he did that pretty well. That is one point. But this is like a traditional organizational structure, and which means that many organizations are good at routine, but that doesn't necessarily translate into being good at doing innovative things like research and building new products or building innovative products and all that kind of thing. So in order to do that, you needed another kind of structure, which is a looser structure. So Professor Dhawan superposed on this formal structure, okay, a kind of another structure which was driven actually, right, uh, through a number of cross-linking mechanisms that cut across the verticals of the ISRO system, okay. And what were these cross-linking mechanisms? Projects are obviously a major cross-linking mechanism. When you do a project, different centers, different work entities, different units, different divisions, they all make contributions and they all do that. So that is a part of it. ISRO followed what is called a program planning and budgeting system, which meant that programs and the money were linked together in a very clear way. This was again a very original effort. Nobody in India had ever done that. The normal government budget is either planned or non-planned or revenue and capital, civil works kind of expenditure. For the first time, for example, everything in SLV3 was linked specifically to what was required to it. So we knew exactly how much money was going to SLV3, how much was going to IRS, how each one of those projects was being funded and how the programs were funded, what is the infrastructure being developed and how much money is going into it. So we do, in ISRO, we used to do a periodic review of the budget, maybe 2 or 3 times in a year we would do this. And every time the money and the projects would be linked together, it also served as a way to review the project. So in the process, a lot of people used to get together and we used to be able to exchange, and different facets of the program kind of got integrated through this network of people connections. We also prepared these 5-year plans and annual plans, which was another forum by means of which we could look at the future and work out a strategy on how to go to the future. And in that process, we also looked at underlying technologies, what had to be done for them, how much to support them, whether they would be realizable or not. So we did a lot of that. So we had periodic what I call area reviews. You wanted to look at propellant development, or you want to look at structures, or you want to look at something else, you would have a review with a set of questions, what is happening internationally, what we're doing, what we should do. So these kinds of things were organized. It's a part of it. And the other very great thing that Professor Dhawan set up was he set up a number of study groups which cut across all the centers of ISRO, where he put a group of people together to define what is required. For example, the IRS was defined first in 1976, well before its launch, right? It was an inter-center group that actually came up with the notion of IRS, and it was done in 76. I think IRS itself was sanctioned as a project only in 1980 or so. So the point is, so these cross-linking mechanisms facilitated what are called people-to-people contacts. And therefore, on the formal structure, which was like any other structure, which is delivering routine activities, we had this network of people and connections of people which were linked to different kinds of programs that actually created a number of routes. As you may know, ideas are generated normally at working level, which is very low in a system hierarchy. They have to go up the ladder in order to be able to be heard. So we created a lot of these formal, informal channels of communication between various levels within the system, basically through these cross-linking processes. And these worked extremely well for ISRO. Right? We have a detailed study on IRS. I can kind of make it available if anybody is interested. But it kind of tells you the kinds of ways in which the informal structure, which was superposed through these mechanisms on formal structure, facilitated the creation of what is called an innovative organization. So you had an ISRO that was a hybrid structure that at one level was very good in projects and programs and the routine delivery of products and services. At the other level, it could look at the future and it could decide what kinds of things it had to do. and to build the capabilities that were needed for the future. Now, these kinds of organizations, in the traditional way in which organizations are done, it's kind of very difficult to build. Of course, they exist, but it's very difficult. And I would argue that Professor Dhawan did this. So he created, in a sense, the first hybrid organization that could do both these activities very well at the same time. I think this was something that nobody really understood, understands. This was a major contribution to a government-based or a government-run space department actually being able to do many of these what I call advanced capabilities. Now, I think that's difficult to.
Right. So, as we come closer to the end of the session, I would ask you what your final thoughts about this would be, whether in terms of uh, in the Indian industry's efforts, in the international space effort, and in the space regime, and also how Professor Dhawan was an integral part of it, with your closing remarks.
Uh, See, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the things that we did, which I think is kind of important. Okay. I would like to give you one specific example of how ISRO kind of transcended this technological kind of barriers. And I would like to talk about IRS as a specific example before I kind of finish, because I think that represents one of the major achievements that we did. Uh, See, when we were looking at IRS, the standard method of doing a sensor was a TV camera. That was what was known as a sensor. And NASA had pioneered what is called the multispectral scanner at that time. Okay, and it was the one that was becoming. And the IRS report, the first one I talked about, it was identified the scanner route as the route to it. But while we were doing the IRS report, a group of my colleagues at the Space Application Center came up with a different concept for sensing. And they said there is a new capability based upon what is called charge coupled device technology, which is like a semiconductor chip, right? That promises to revolutionize the way in which sensor development can be done. So this was an idea in 76, but ISRO was able to take that idea, and by about the time 1979, 1980, when IRS was being configured, it had been converted into a working product and a working capability. So when we choose the sensor for IRS, we had already done enough work to make sure that we completely bypassed this multispectral scanner generation, right? And we moved from the TV, which was the Bhaskara kind of sensor, to the CCD at that time, which was the world standard. Only one other country, France and India, were the pioneers when we put up the first satellites in the early 80s. NASA went with the MSS technology for its next version. So, in a sense, we can say that from being a technological laggard, ISRO actually became at the forefront of the technological revolution. That is largely because of what I would call this innovative setup that was the key at that time. So this is what I meant when I said that Professor Dhawan created this hybrid organization structure that enabled this to happen. Now there were a number of other examples in ISRO where I can go on and talk about it for a very long time. But the gyro area, we did very creative things. In the control systems for the PSLV launcher, we had an architecture of microprocessors that nobody had ever used in the world. We chose the most advanced propellant without any kind of capability inside at that time for building the booster stages of the PSLV rocket. So these represent, in my opinion, world first or very close to world first in the international domain. And these were all possible only because of what Professor Dhawan brought to the table for the organization that he created. Coming back a little bit to the industry part, he pioneered, of course, a lot of the. So he made it a mandate that 70% of ISRO's budget more than 70% of ISRO's budget should go from industry. ISRO was like every other organization, it wanted everything inside, but he kind of forced ISRO to move it from inside to outside. We anticipated the missile technology control regime, which was on the cards at the time, because after the SLV flight, successful SLV flight. And we kind of made sure that all the propellants that were required were made not inside ISRO, but in industry. Okay. And we pioneered a lot of the technology transfer. All the fabrication of the various rocket motor cases, as well as the structures that were required for satellites, were moved to industry. Small and medium scale industry were particularly important. SLV had a whole host of industrial centers where ISRO engineers were deployed in order to make sure of quality. So we actually pioneered, and Professor Dhawan's vision was that satellite should be built in industry, rocket should be built in industry, all this infrastructure and the services that space programs would require should be go to industry. In a sense, you can argue that it was a microcosm of what was seen in Silicon Valley of California at that time. And Professor Dhawan had just, when he joined ISRO as its chairman, he had just finished the teaching stint at Caltech. And he used to often talk about, the area around Caltech and Los Angeles, Silicon Valley. So, in a sense, you can argue that that was the kind of view that he wanted. Internationally, we were in what is called a very favorable technology regime at that time, called the sanctuary regime in space. The Cold War had kind of stabilized. So while the US and the USSR were at loggerheads, right, by and large, it was a benign environment. Right? The space treaties had been kind of signed and ratified because of the agreement between the two superpowers. We could have collaboration with the Soviet Union and the US and Europe without any major problems. After the SLV launch, we faced a lot of sanctions because of its link with missiles, so that was a reality. ISRO successfully navigated those waters through a very carefully engineered plan of reverse engineering and technology development, which I think has stood the test of time, and we are pretty good in most requirements for the launch vehicle part today. The other thing that we had done, but not done very well, we had signed the Outer Space Treaty and the three other treaties when they were drafted, but we are not ratified. Professor Dhawan tried very hard to make sure that India became formally a part of the space, the official space regime. But there was a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of inbuilt resistance on the parts of the user ministries to actually do that. So I remember working with them, trying to get these okays from all the ministries. We built up reams of files. And then an event happened in 1979, 1980, I don't remember the date. Skylab, major US space ship kind of thing, space lab actually, was re-entering, and the planned re-entry was directly hitting India. So there was a possibility that the big piece could land somewhere in India and create a lot of damage. So there was a lot of interest, expressed at that time in order to be able to find out whether how can India protect itself. And then we found out that we are not ratified the treaties, which Professor Dhawan had been trying to push for so long. So finally, we got around and we ratified those treaties. And we did that just before the second United Nations conference on the peaceful use of outer space, which took place in Vienna in 1982. And at the conference, I remember we made an announcement in the conference, again a Professor Dhawan initiative, where ISRO decided that it would formally allow people from the developing countries, Africa, all developing countries, to come and spend time with ISRO in ISRO establishments to learn about satellites, rockets, and the applications of space. And so we formally made an offer, and we started a program called the Sharing of Experience in Space in ISRO, where the Ministry of External Affairs chipped in and helped us a lot in order to make it work. The other thing that we did is we also announced, I think then or maybe a little bit later, that IRS data would be available freely to all the countries. And if they wanted to set up a ground station. So these were the other initiatives that Professor Dhawan took. He was what I would call a believer that the space regime should not become weaponized. Fortunately, it had not yet become weaponized at that time. Today it is, of course, different. And he believed very strongly that the space capabilities actually provided means of which arms agreements between superpowers and between different countries could actually be verified. As you know, there are many treaties, the ABM Treaty and the SALT treaties between the US and USSR had this euphemism called National Technical Means of Verification, which are nothing but reconnaissance satellites. Okay. And he believed very strongly. So he was an advocate in a sense of a peaceful space regime, or at least a non-weaponized space regime, to be more precise. And that was the stance that he took. I wouldn't know what he would do if he were today. Okay. But that is broadly the kind of thing. So in a sense, you would call him a Dow, not necessarily a hawk, but at the same time, not necessarily a person who would go away from doing something if it was in the national interest. I would argue that he represents a kind of India that believe very strongly in the Indian ethos and in the Indian way of doing things. And what I would call, he took a lot of pride in being Indian and wanting to promote strong indigenous. I think that was really something that we all learned from him. And he also inspired a lot of us. We all worked very closely with him. And he was a fantastic source of inspiration. And he kind of lived a very simple life. He was very modest about what he had done. Yeah, he was a very hard taskmaster, but he was very, very, what should we say? I joined it as a very brash, young IIT MBA who knew everything in the world and who had answers to all the questions in the world. But he converted a lot, and a lot of my colleagues were pretty much like me. And he converted all of us into a group of extraordinarily, not only not only used our talents extremely well, but he made us realize that first and last we were Indians, and that we were also Indians. I think that is the kind of great thing that we are.
Right.
Personally, my thing is the stint I spent in ISRO with best year of my life. Unfortunately, we can't go back and really.
Right. I think, given Professor Dhawan's legacy, we could possibly go on and talk about it for hours, but we're short on time. So I will say thank you, Professor, for sharing his legacy with us, and thank you for joining us for this in conversation at the 6th ORF Kalpana Chawla Space Policy Dialogue. And stay tuned for more. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
sir.
much. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Pulkit. I have to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to share with you. I mean, Professor Dhawan was a great Indian, and a true patriot. I think we must definitely honor him. I felt duty bound to do this. And, I'm very happy that you gave me the time and the support.
Right. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you so much.